Where am I and what is the significance of this hiking trail? I'll get to that in a moment. First, let me introduce myself. Hi, I'm Valerie Campbell. I was the key set costumer on Gilmore Girls costume supervisor for a year in the life, and welcome to the second and what I hope will be a series of videos where I share a little bit about my life stories from behind the scenes and the inspiration behind a few of the recipes in my ice cream cookbook. A cookbook for ice cream? Yeah. Actually, you have to cook the ingredients before you churn it up into that frozen, delicious treat. This is the story of the Ice House Canyon Blackberry Cinnamon Granola Honey Froyo, inspired by my friend Brian LeGrady. In 2007, right after Gilmore Girls ended, I got a call from Eddie Castro. He was the costume designer on Ugly Betty, a show that I had watched and really loved. He offered me a job on set, and I worked for a few months and then eventually moved into the day checker position. I had never day checked before. Day checking is basically when you work one day whenever they need you. And on this show, they needed you a lot. So I worked about 3 to 5 days a week, and I got paid an extra $1 an hour. My job consisted of mostly dressing the mode employees. They are the fashionable ones, which is kind of ironic because I am not fashionable. But I quickly learned that you just grab something from this rack, something from that rack, and accessorize to the point where you think you have enough, and then you add one more extra piece. I was basically dressing all the background, and then if they needed extra help with the principals, I would help out there. Just as I was figuring out this new job, I was faced with a choice. A friend had called and said, "Hey, do you want to come work on this movie down in Mexico? It's called Dragon Ball." I was working. I didn't need a job except for the fact that there was a writer's strike about to hit, which meant that we had a couple more weeks of work until the writers went on strike. And then I would be out of work. So I decided to work on that movie. And in a twist of fate, I helped Eddie Castro, the one that hired me on Ugly Betty, get a job on the show. He, along with half the Ugly Betty crew, helped us with fittings, sourcing material, and anything else we couldn't do down in Mexico. It was a very difficult, complicated show with a lot of moving parts. When it was over, I was so exhausted. That show was a nightmare. And for the first time in my life, I contemplated getting out of the business entirely. I just needed a break. Colin and I ended up taking our dog Molly on a hike for our anniversary. And while I was on the hike, I ended up getting bit by a tick. Or at least maybe I got bit by a tick. I got bit by something. And a short while later, I broke out in hives. I was scratching and itching for about 2 months until I finally decided to go to the doctor. While I was there, he asked me if I had ever gotten bit by a tick. And I said, well, I might have. So he decided to treat me for Lyme disease. That medication kind of wipes out your system, and I was just exhausted. So I was out of work for a little while. I was getting bored in the house, and one of my friends called and said, "Hey, are you working?" And I said, "No, I'm going to the doctor. I really need to take care of myself, but I'm so bored that, it would be nice to just work one day." A few hours later, I guess she had given my name to one of the supervisors who called me and said, "Hey, can you come in right now? One of my employees is sick and I need you to fill in, and I need someone with experience." So I rushed over to Warner Brothers, which is where we shot Gilmore Girls. I filled in for one of the set costumers, and at the end of the day, the supervisor asked if I could come back the next day. The only problem was I had a doctor's appointment at 9 o'clock. And he said, call time's around 6 a.m., but why don't you just come in after your doctor's appointment? And I was like, are you sure? Are you sure you don't want someone that just works? They're like, listen, there are a lot of people out there, but we want someone with experience. It is much better to hire someone with experience than to bring in someone that is green, that does not know how to do the job. So I said, okay, well, I'll come back tomorrow. He ended up calling me for random days here and there whenever it worked out with my appointments. And eventually, he told me that another show really needed a day checker that could work a few more days than he could give me. That show was Without a Trace. It was the 7th season of a show that had been running for many, many years, with the crew that had been together for a very long time. I was new to the show. I hardly knew anyone except maybe some random person that day played on Gilmore Girls or another show that I had worked on before Gilmore Girls. So there was this one day. I think it was a Monday because I had gone over to the craft service table and people were talking about what they had done that weekend. Craft service is the department that takes care of the crew. They provide food and beverages, coffee, tea, snacks. Sometimes every meal you will eat will be at that craft service table. And it is definitely like a little water cooler. This is where you get to meet everyone from the cast and crew. So on this one day, I think it was a Monday because the weekend had just passed, and I see this camera assistant who I had talked to before. He was having a conversation with one of his coworkers about what he did that weekend. And he said, "Oh, I went up to Brian's cabin." Cabin? All I heard was the word cabin. I was intrigued. Yeah, Brian has a hiking cabin. It's in the middle of the woods near Mount Baldy. All I knew was I needed to meet this Brian. And he needed to become my friend because I wanted to go to his cabin. Why was I so infatuated with cabins? Well, when I was a little kid, my grandmommy had a cabin in the middle of the woods. It was one of those Forest Service cabins, the ones with the 99-year leases. You don't really own the property, but you do own the structure. And if anything happens to that structure, well, we'll get to that in a minute. She actually got it when my dad was a teenager, and it pretty much was the only thing she could afford. And for our family, it was the highlight of our summer. My dad was the youngest of 3 boys, and his brother Michael would also use the cabin with his family. One set of parents would go up with their kids, and then the next set of parents would come up with their kids, leaving all the cousins to play as the other set of parents went back down the mountain. The cabin was a very simple structure. It was an open floor plan downstairs. On one side was the kitchen. There was a sink that had water that was fed from the stream. Next to it was a cast iron stove that only the most daring cook would use. There was an icebox filled with cans and condiments and things that we didn't want the rats to get at. Next to it was a propane stove. And right next to that was a very old refrigerator. The kind that you have to chip the ice away every time you want to use it. On the other side of the room was a couch that would pull out into a bed. The parents always slept there so that they could tend to the fire in the middle of the night and keep the cabin warm. There was another couch on the other side, and in the center of the room there was a very large wooden table. When dinner was not being served on it, you'd have at least a few cousins playing a board game or a game of cards there. And on the other side of that was a cupboard for all the dishes and a door that led to the back porch. The back porch was a concrete slab with a wooden log that protected you from falling into the stream. There was a large table outside on that porch that we would eat our breakfasts at. And if you were old enough, you could sit on the log while you sat at the table. If you looked up, you saw a tree. And that tree was leaning against the tree that was next to our cabin. And every time we visited the cabin, we would look up at that tree and say, one of these days, that tree's going to hit this cabin. And one of those days, well, we'll get to that in a minute. In the corner of the cabin, right next to the cupboard, was a set of very steep, creaky wooden stairs that led you to the second story. The second story was a very large room that went from one end of the cabin to the other. It was filled with beds that had been discarded over many, many years. The roof was pitched, and if you walked down the center of the cabin, you did not have to duck. At night, on days where all the cousins were there, you had to fight to get the good bed. Several cousins would share a bed and tell ghost stories until the wee hours of the night, until the roar of the stream lulled us to sleep. And if you're wondering where we went to the bathroom, it was outside in the outhouse. and there was no shower. There were very little modern conveniences. There was no phone, but there was electricity. There were several other cabins nearby, and a short walk away there was a spring where we were often asked to fetch water from. The spring was located in the ruins of a cabin that had burned down many years before. The water flowed through its foundation and made tiny ponds. There was a pipe sticking out of the ground that flowed like a water hose. Nearby were wild raspberries and strawberries that we could pick for breakfast or an afternoon snack. Around the time that I was about to turn 16, that tree, the one that was being held up into place by the tree that was on our side of the stream, gave way and came crashing down into the cabin, knocking it off its foundation. The neighbors in the next cabin were the first to discover it, and they called my grandmommy and granddaddy to let them know. What's crazy about it was they were planning on going up to the cabin the next weekend. We were all very thankful they weren't there. A short time later, my brother, along with his college friends, went on a little trip up to the cabin, took pictures, and assessed the situation. It was devastating. My granddaddy talked about rebuilding, but it never happened. When the tree hit the cabin, our summers were over. No more trips to the cabin, no more vacations with our cousins. It was the end of an era. I have a very vivid memory from the last time I remember seeing that cabin. Actually, it started the night before. I couldn't sleep. I was so excited we were going up to the cabin. I hadn't seen it in such a long time, and then I thought about Grandmommy, because it was Grandmommy's cabin. And then I thought about my dad's dad, Buzz. Technically, I guess he was my grandfather, but I was introduced to him on the front porch of my Uncle Michael's house as Buzz. And at that time, I was introduced to him. I had no idea that that was my grandfather. I had no idea who this man was. My dad just introduced me to Buzz. Other than the introduction, I don't really remember what he said or did. I just remember he was quite fragile. And in the moment, that night, before going to visit the cabin, all I could think of was, if Buzz, my grandfather, passed away, would I cry at the funeral? This thought played on a loop. A few months before, my sister invited us over for Father's Day, where she introduced us to her future husband. My grandpa came, and at the end of the visit, we gave him a ride home. And as my dad and I drove away, my grandpa realized he had forgotten his coat. So he hopped in his car and chased us down, frantically honking his horn and waving at us to pull over. We looked in our rear view, wondering who this crazy man was, only to realize it was Grandpa. This was my mom's dad. Now, I knew my grandpa. I had a relationship with my grandpa, and my thoughts were going from grandpa to grandfather. Eventually, I ended up getting to sleep, and the next day we drove up to the cabin. Shortly after we arrived, I think we were still unloading the car, my sister pulled up, which was weird. We weren't expecting her. She wasn't planning on coming. She went up to my mom and proceeded to tell her that Grandpa had passed. The first words out of my mouth were, "Which one?" Obviously, every set of grandparents has a special name, and ours did too, but it was just so eerie that the night before that I had the most random thought of, would I cry at grandfather's funeral if he passed away? And there was no phone at the cabin, which is why my sister had to drive all the way up there. And as soon as we pulled into the cabin, we turned around and headed home. I don't really remember if we even saw the cabin ever again. It's just, that's my last memory of the cabin. And the most random thing about it was that I was having this thought at the exact moment that my grandpa passed away. When we were at the funeral for my grandpa, I cried. I cried when I saw my mom cry. And many years later, when my grandfather passed away, I didn't go to the funeral. I did not know him. Families are complicated. Let me know if you cried at your grandpa's funeral. Maybe they're still alive and you're crying at the thought that they might not be around. Where was I before I got on that tangent of cabins and grandfathers? Oh yes, Brian LeGrady. I was at the craft service table and I asked him, "Who's Brian? Which one's Brian? I need to meet Brian." So he described him. He's got long hair, kind of blondish, silverish. He usually wears it in a ponytail. He definitely probably might have on a tie-dye shirt. He's kind of like a Hungarian hippie. He's very nice. You're going to love Brian. I looked for him that first day, but I couldn't find him. Maybe he took the day off, or maybe he was on a different unit. Eventually, I found Brian, and when I did, I was like, "Hi, Brian. I know we've never met before, but I hear you have a cabin, and I really want to go to your cabin. And we're going to be best friends because I really want to go to your cabin." And he was like, "Yeah, you could go to the cabin, but first you really should come up when I'm there. The next time I'm going to be up there is Christmas. We're having a little Christmas party. And remember, it's a hiking cabin. Just so you know, it's a 45-minute hike up to the cabin, and there is no way to get up there other than your 2 feet." So at Christmas, Colin and I, along with our dog Molly, hiked up the trail for the very first time. This Christmas party was like none other. When we got up to the cabin, we were greeted with a warm fire on a crisp, cool day. There was patches of snow on the ground, and we met all the other cabin owners and friends that Brian had invited. Brian was furiously cooking on the wood stove, trying to get all the food ready before it got dark and people needed to hike back down the trail. I helped him cook and learned how to make chicken paprikash from scratch. Remember, Brian is Hungarian, and this is a dish that comes from his family. Colin helped fetch water from the spring, as it's a dry cabin, and there's no bathroom or toilet. There is an incinerator toilet, but it doesn't always work, so you don't want to necessarily use that one. But there is no running water to the cabin. There's electricity and there's a phone, but your cell is not going to work, and there's no internet at this cabin. And one other thing, what goes up must come down. Or in fact, a lot of things go up and don't come down. In fact, there is a vintage ice cream maker in the cabin, which provoked me one day when I was up there to make a little frozen dessert with all the leftovers. I had some yogurt that if I didn't eat, I was going to have to hike it down. So I added a little honey, blackberries, and cinnamon, cooked that down, and then I made a little granola crisp with some stale marshmallows that were sitting in a cabinet, some blackberries, a little bit of butter, granola, and some cinnamon sugar. Then I turned it up the next day and put it all together. Every recipe has a story, and this story overlaps with quite a few other recipes that we'll get to another time.